The paintings in his basement were changing overnight. The musty air of the basement always carried a hint of forgotten things for Arthur. At 52, a retired art teacher with a penchant for collecting discarded treasures, he had filled the dimly lit space beneath his Victorian home with an eclectic assortment of finds. Amongst the dusty furniture and stacks of old books, a series of framed paintings leaned against one wall, their previous owner unknown. He'd picked them up at a local estate sale, drawn by their intriguing, if somewhat unsettling, imagery. The paintings were landscapes, each depicting a different scene: a windswept moor under a stormy sky, a dense forest shrouded in mist, a desolate beach at twilight. They were amateurish, the brushstrokes heavy, the colors often muted, yet there was a raw, almost visceral quality to them that had captivated Arthur. He hadn't paid much for them, intending to eventually reframe them or perhaps even paint over the canvases. For now, they simply resided in the basement, silent witnesses to the dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the small, grimy windows. One Monday morning, while retrieving a box of old photographs, Arthur noticed something different about the moor painting. The sky, which he distinctly remembered as a turbulent gray, now held streaks of an angry, bruised purple. The gnarled, solitary tree in the foreground seemed to have shifted its position slightly, its branches reaching out at a more menacing angle. Arthur frowned. Had he misremembered? He'd only glanced at the paintings a few times since bringing them home. He dismissed it as a trick of the dim light or the fallibility of his memory. The next day, he went down to the basement again, this time looking for an old toolbox. He paused by the paintings. The forest scene now seemed subtly altered. The mist appeared thicker, more oppressive, and a faint, almost imperceptible path he hadn't noticed before seemed to wind deeper into the trees. A prickle of unease began to stir within him. He was usually quite good with details, especially visual ones, given his background. He was certain these changes were real. He started paying closer attention to the paintings, making a mental note of their details each time he went into the basement. The changes were gradual, almost imperceptible at first glance, but undeniably there. The waves in the twilight beach scene would be slightly higher, the shadows longer. A bird that hadn't been there before would appear in the stormy sky. The phenomenon was unsettling, bordering on the surreal. Arthur, a man of logic and reason, found himself confronted with something that defied explanation. He considered the possibility of a draft causing the canvases to shift against each other, creating the illusion of change, but the alterations were within the paintings themselves, the very fabric of the painted scenes. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the paint was still somehow reacting to the environment, the colors subtly shifting over time. But this didn't account for the appearance of new elements or the discernible changes in composition. He started to feel a strange fascination mixed with a growing sense of unease. He found himself going down to the basement more frequently, drawn by the silent, evolving narratives on the canvases. One morning, he noticed a significant change in the moor painting. A small, dark figure had appeared in the distance, barely discernible against the stormy sky. It looked like a person, hunched over, seemingly struggling against the wind. Arthur felt a sudden chill, a sense of foreboding emanating from the painting. The appearance of the figure marked a turning point. The changes were no longer subtle shifts in light or the addition of minor details. The paintings were actively evolving, their narratives unfolding in a way that felt both organic and deeply unsettling. He began to document the changes, taking photographs of each painting every day. The progression was undeniable. The dark figure on the moor moved closer with each passing day, its form becoming slightly clearer. The path in the forest scene seemed to lengthen, leading towards an increasingly ominous darkness. The waves on the beach grew larger, more turbulent, and the sky darkened with an approaching storm. Arthur felt like he was witnessing something impossible, a silent story unfolding in paint, a story that seemed to be heading towards an unknown, and potentially sinister, conclusion. He considered getting rid of the paintings, but a strange compulsion held him back. He felt like he was a witness to something significant, something that needed to be observed, understood. He researched the estate sale where he had bought the paintings, hoping to find some information about their previous owner. The sale had been handled by a third party, and the history of the items was largely unknown. There were no names, no clues. The paintings seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The changes in the paintings continued, each day bringing new developments. The dark figure on the moor was now clearly a man, his posture suggesting exhaustion or despair. In the forest scene, the faint path now led to a dark, foreboding structure in the distance. The storm on the beach painting was now directly overhead, the waves crashing against a shadowy shoreline. Arthur's sleep became restless, his dreams filled with the turbulent landscapes of the paintings, the silent figures and ominous settings. He felt a growing sense of dread, as if the unfolding narratives were somehow connected to him, a silent warning. One morning, he went down to the basement and found the most significant change yet. In the moor painting, the exhausted figure had fallen to the ground, his form still against the bruised purple sky. In the forest, the path now ended at the dark structure, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from the canvas. On the beach, a single, dark shape lay washed up on the shore, battered by the storm. A profound sense of unease settled over Arthur. The stories in the painting seemed to have reached a climax, a silent, desolate end. He spent the day in a state of anxious anticipation, wondering what the next change would bring. He felt a growing compulsion to understand the connection between these evolving canvases and his own life. The following morning, he went down to the basement with a heavy heart. The paintings were different again, but this time, the changes were subtle, almost imperceptible. The fallen figure on the moor seemed slightly less still, a faint suggestion of movement in his limbs. The windows of the dark structure in the forest appeared to have a faint light within. The dark shape on the beach seemed to have shifted, its outline less defined. A glimmer of something akin to hope flickered within Arthur. The stories weren't over. They were continuing, albeit in a more ambiguous way. He continued his daily observations, the photographs documenting the slow, almost imperceptible changes. The figure on the moor eventually rose, his posture still weary but now suggesting a struggle to move forward. A faint light grew stronger in the windows of the forest structure. The shape on the beach began to resemble a small boat, tossed by calmer waves. Arthur felt a strange connection to these silent narratives, a sense of shared journey. He didn't understand why the paintings were changing, or what their ultimate destination was, but he felt compelled to witness their unfolding. Then, one morning, he went down to the basement and saw a change that made his blood run cold. In the moor painting, the figure, now walking slowly but steadily, looked up. And his face, it was Arthur's face. He recoiled, a wave of shock and terror washing over him. The figure in the painting, struggling through the desolate landscape, was him. He looked at the other paintings. In the forest scene, a figure that also resembled him stood at the entrance of the illuminated structure, looking out. On the beach, a small boat with a lone figure that bore his likeness sailed towards a distant horizon under a clearing sky. The paintings weren't just changing, they were depicting him, his struggles, his journey. But a journey through what? And why were these scenes unfolding in his basement? A terrifying thought occurred to him. Were these paintings not just depicting a story, but predicting one? Was he somehow connected to these desolate landscapes and the journey of the figure within them? He spent the next few days in a state of heightened anxiety, every minor setback in his own life feeling like a reflection of the struggles in the paintings. A difficult phone call mirrored the figure's weary posture. A moment of inspiration felt like the faint light in the forest structure. A sense of hope after a long day mirrored the boat sailing towards the horizon. The line between the paintings and his own reality began to blur. He felt like he was living a life dictated by the silent narratives in his basement. He decided he had to understand the origin of these paintings. He returned to the estate sale location, hoping to find any lingering clues. He spoke to neighbors, showed them photographs of the paintings. One elderly woman remembered the previous owner of the house, a reclusive artist who had disappeared years ago without a trace. She remembered him painting strange landscapes in the basement. A chilling realization dawned on Arthur. These were the artist's paintings. And they weren't just changing, they were unfinished. The artist hadn't disappeared. His life, his journey, was continuing on these canvases, somehow linked to the house, to the basement, and now, inexplicably, to Arthur. The paintings continued to evolve, the figure that looked like Arthur progressing on his journeys. The moor landscape eventually gave way to a more fertile ground. The forest opened into a sunlit meadow. The boat reached the horizon, disappearing into a bright, clear sky. And then, one morning, Arthur went down to the basement and found the paintings completely blank. The canvases were bare, the stories seemingly concluded. A profound sense of peace settled over him. The silent narratives were finished. The connection, whatever it had been, was broken. He looked at the blank canvases, no longer unsettling, but simply empty. He finally understood. He hadn't just been observing a story, he had been a part of it, a silent continuation of the reclusive artist's unfinished journey, a journey that had now reached its peaceful end. The basement no longer felt musty and filled with forgotten things, but simply quiet, waiting for its next chapter.